Let's get started. So welcome to our webinar on wildlife policy and social justice. My name is Kevin Bixby. I am the founder and executive director of Wildlife for All, which is both a nonprofit organization and a national campaign to reform wildlife management in the United States. My co-host is Michelle Lute, carnivore conservation director for Project Coyote. And over the next hour, we will explore the connection between wildlife policy and social justice. So Michelle and I will speak for about 45 minutes. We'll walk you through some of the problems with the current system of wildlife management, what Wildlife for All and our partners are doing to address those problems, and share some suggestions for what you can do. We'll spend the remainder of our time answering as many of your questions as we can. If you want to ask a question, please send it in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. Our moderator today is Bea Freelander. She's the co-founder and president of Attorneys for Animals, and she'll be curating the questions and giving them to us. We'll try to get to them as many as possible. We will also be posting links to resources in the chat. This webinar is being recorded. We will send a link to the recording to everyone who registered and post it on the Wildlife for All website as well. In the next day or two, we will be emailing a very short survey to everyone who attended today, asking for your feedback. And if you could take just a minute to fill it out and send it back, that would be much appreciated. A note on terminology. Throughout this presentation, when we refer to hunters, we are including other consumptive users of wildlife, namely anglers and trappers. And I should say at the outset that this is not a presentation about hunting per se, but about the politics of wildlife management in which hunting and hunters figure prominently. So let's get started. I will share my screen. Okay, I hope you can all see that. So I want to warn you that the next slide shows photos of dead and trapped wild animals that are disturbing images, but they represent the reality of wildlife management today. Okay. So I've been a wildlife advocate my entire career. I've been involved in many wildlife-related campaigns, including efforts to protect wolves, to ban wildlife killing contests, to end recreational trapping, etc. And at some point, I began to notice that while I was doing these things in my home state of New Mexico mostly, advocates were tackling the same issues in other states. And we were all essentially playing a game of whack-a-mole on a national scale. And many of us have come to realize that all of these separate issues are symptoms of an entrenched system that was essentially the same system in every state. These issues were the shiny objects that kept us distracted from the root problem, which is the system itself, a system that prioritizes hunters and hunting over other voices and ways of valuing wildlife. We began to understand that wildlife in the US would never be effectively protected until the system itself was scrapped and replaced with something better. And that's how Wildlife for All came to be. So most people, well, many of you do on this webinar, but the general public generally doesn't think much about wildlife policy or its connection to broader social justice issues. But when you think about what is wildlife policy, one way of looking at it is that it is the formal expression embodying in laws and regulations of a society's relationship with the wild animals we share the earth with and wild nature more broadly. Wildlife policies reflect someone's decision about which species are important and deserving of our protection, and which are of no consequence, which need to be managed by humans, usually by lethal methods, and which can be left to their own devices. Ideally, in a democracy, wildlife policy reflects our collective attitudes and sense of responsibilities towards the natural world, developed through a process in which everyone's voice is heard, in which all species are valued, and science-informed decisions are made after careful consideration is given to the broad public interest in wildlife, including future generations. And as we're going to explain, wildlife governance in this country is not democratic. Instead, it is an outdated, entrenched system designed to prioritize the interests and values of a shrinking minority of Americans, namely hunters, anglers, and trappers, who demographically tend to be older white men at the expense of other people and wildlife. It is arguably another example of the legacy of colonialism in our society. The focus of Wildlife for All is on wildlife management at the state level, because under our federalist system of government, states have primary jurisdiction over the wild animals living within their boundaries. There are some exceptions, like federally protected, threatened, and endangered species, but for the most part, states call the shots when it comes to wildlife policy. Every state is different, but in general, the structure of wildlife governance is the same in all states. The legislature passes laws that provide the rationale, scope, and legal authority for wildlife management. Every state has a wildlife agency that is responsible for implementing and enforcing wildlife policies, either as a standalone agency or part of a larger department. And in most states, a volunteer wildlife commission is appointed by the governor to establish policies or advise the state wildlife agency. Historically, the system has been funded by two main sources: the sale of hunting and fishing licenses and federal grants tied to the sale of guns, bullets, gasoline for motorboats, and other items. In many states, the state wildlife agency receives no general funding from the legislature, which limits the agency's transparency and accountability to the general public. The problems with this system are also the same in every state, more or less. It is a system that was developed in large part by hunters, primarily for the benefit of hunters. It is out of step with current ecological understanding, norms of democratic governance, public trust principles, which I'll explain later, and changing public values. The system itself acts as a barrier to the type of conservation that is urgently needed to protect biodiversity in the United States in the face of a global extinction crisis and threats such as climate change. So we're going to talk a lot about problems today. So I want to add now that there is hope. By reforming state wildlife management to be more democratic, just, compassionate, and focused on protecting wild species and ecosystems, which is the mission of Wildlife for All, we can create a more just and equitable society and a safe, healthy planet for all. So now I'd like to turn it over to Michelle.
Thanks, Kevin. So let's dig in a little bit more about what we mean by wildlife policy and how it works. So by wildlife policy, we're referring to a set of rules, regulations, and guidelines that govern the management, conservation, and protection of wildlife and their habitats. This can include federal, state, and local policies that impact the way we interact with and protect wildlife, including hunting and fishing regulations, land use policies, and conservation efforts. The decision-making process that sets state wildlife policy can range from technocratic on one end of the spectrum, where biologists or other scientists that are considered experts set the policy and simply inform the public of those decisions. The head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Martha Williams, pictured here with her dear friend, might be thought of as a sort of technocrat, although currently her expertise to head the agency is in question. On the other end of the spectrum, co-management occurs as a, quote, participatory decision-making process in which the regulation of natural resource use is shared between the users and other stakeholders, such as the national or subnational government, non-governmental organizations, and local cooperatives. And this is a definition taken directly from Freitas et al. 2019. Other definitions of co-management emphasize that it often occurs between two sovereign entities, such as what we've seen recently with the 5 tribes co-managing Bears Ears National Monument with the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Forest Service. Unfortunately, good examples of this happening in an equitable and just manner for all life are rare. The current state-level management is an outdated and entrenched system built on an ethic of domination and exploitation. This entrenched system dates back to the Teddy Roosevelt era of wise use management, in which conservation was envisioned only for certain species, those desired by hunters. Key players at this time were folks like Aldo Leopold, who basically wrote the book on game management. It's called Game Management. But he evolved to become the father of wildlife ecology and the U.S. wilderness system, essentially. Another player was Gifford Pinchot, Roosevelt's mentee and the first head of the U.S. Forest Service. These traditionally trained foresters applied concepts from agriculture and forestry to wildlife management. They sought to maximize deer and elk, basically like you would maximize crops for the greatest good for the greatest number of humans. And that's to quote Pinchot's very kind of famously quoted utilitarian perspective. They also advocated killing any perceived competition for that prey, in other words, predators. Aldo Leopold eventually learned the error of his ways, but unfortunately states have not. They still function in a system intended mainly to serve consumptive users and are dismissive of other values and voices. So while broad swaths of the American public value wildlife alive and protecting the diversity of life, state wildlife agencies spend their time setting policy on how many deer hunters can kill, how they report their kills, and the price of hunting tags. And they fail to set policy that would regulate the killing of predators or protect songbirds, invertebrates, or the swath of species that go completely ignored. Examples of states ignoring the values of broad and diverse public values and desires to reduce dominion and killing of wildlife are myriad and many. Just to name a few, the Nevada Board of Wildlife Commissioners, constant refusal to ban wildlife killing contests, which are contests where participants compete for cash and prizes to kill the most, largest, or even smallest of various species that have no protections. This issue has been presented in numerous times, and each time commissioners listen not to the many people speaking up, but to a vocal minority of participants that distract the conversation by insisting that these contests are, quote, calling contests, despite the fact that they end with piles of dead animals that are dumped in ditches or dumpsters. Other states that ignore broad grassroots movements to ban killing contests include Virginia and Illinois. Right now, only 8 states have so far banned this egregious incentivized slaughter. States like Montana, as another example, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, ignore tens of thousands of comments asking that they protect wolves rather than allow them to be hunted, trapped, snared, baited, killed in their dens with their pups, and by U.S. Department of Agricultural agents. Additionally, because state wildlife agencies are captured by a few special interest groups, policy doesn't match scientific evidence for best practices or the desires and needs of broader publics. So most Americans are mutualists or pluralists, believing that means that they believe that humans and wildlife are meant to live in harmony, and thus that wildlife deserve rights similar to the rights of humans, as depicted in this chart from the American Wildlife Values Report, where I've added some arrows to denote that these numbers are actually also shifting. So this is from a couple years ago, but we're seeing that the numbers of mutualists are increasing while traditionalists, along with hunters, are declining. Most Americans recognize the intrinsic value of wildlife, which is the inherent value of an entity to live without serving the needs or uses of another. Most Americans are much more interested in wildlife viewing opportunities, which can be enjoyed by many more people than hunting. So in most hunting circumstances, one person takes a life and few others benefit. The only other folks that would benefit is if you share game meat with family or friends. Most Americans do not support trophy hunting, which is basically all hunting of predators and bears who are technically omnivores, because few people hunt these species for food or other subsistence. Yet current policies don't reflect these values, nor the science increasingly making clear that human-caused mortality disrupts the important social fabric of wild animal lives and can actually serve to increase human-wildlife conflict. So who benefits? Take a step back and look at the demographics that are served by this system. This is data from the 2022 on hunter demographics. Commissions are dominated by older white men, and despite the fact that state agencies' efforts to make their hunting programs more appealing to younger audiences or women or BIPOC communities, the demographic being catered to in state policy still matches the makeup of commissions, older white men. Consider Wisconsin as another example, where this 7-member Natural Resources Board includes 5 white men, 4 of whom voted for a wolf hunting season with a quota that ignored federally obligated tribal consultation and their own agency scientist recommendations. The Ojibwe tribes of the Great Lakes consider wolves sacred family members. Thus, they do not hunt the nearly 50% of the wolf quota that is allocated to them by treaty rights. And instead, they kind of claim, so to speak, those wolves to protect them, essentially. The response in Wisconsin, the anti-wolf contingent on the board openly discussed in a public meeting how to circumvent the tribe's treaty rights in an auction-style negotiation that sold wolves to the highest bidder. Thousands of years of sacred relationships be damned. The connection between social justice and wildlife policy is clear. The entrenched system exists to protect the status quo and privileges the desires of those in power at the expense of life, the interests of diverse Americans, and evidence-based and inclusive democratic processes. So I'm going to hand it back to Kevin now. In this next section, we're going to elaborate on the 4 basic problems of wildlife governance today. First, that wildlife management is undemocratic.
Thanks, Michelle. And my apologies for that advancing the slide prematurely. So Michelle covered some of this. Not only is wildlife management not democratic, it's a bastion of anti-democracy. It's been captured by a narrow demographic and small group of users, hunters, anglers, and trappers, who do not represent the broad public interest in wildlife. And these are the people who are disproportionately represented on wildlife commissions and among agency staff, and who play a pivotal role in shaping wildlife policy. And as you can see from these stats, which support what Michelle showed on her previous slide, hunters and anglers make up less than 15% of the American public, but they occupy at least 70% of all state wildlife commission seats. So the issue is not whether a particular commissioner likes to hunt or fish. It's who they represent statistically and who they don't. And as you can see by this this chart, which compares attributes of hunters and anglers to the general public, hunters and anglers tend to be my animation's not working. Oh, hold on. There we go. They tend to be older. You can see hunters and anglers on the left here and public on the right. They also tend to be white, and they tend to be men. And as Michelle mentioned, they tend also to be traditionalist in their value orientation, meaning they view wild animals mainly as resources intended for human use. So another way of saying this is that commissions disproportionately exclude women, youth, people of color, and the majority of Americans who do not see wild animals primarily as resources for human use. So the lack of broad representation in the wildlife policy arena is at odds with the idea that wildlife is a public trust. And this is a legal doctrine that has its origins in English common law and has been upheld by US courts over the years. As applied to wildlife, it means that wild animals don't belong to anyone. All wildlife species are part of a public trust, not just those species of interest to consumptive users. Everyone benefits from wildlife and healthy ecosystems, so we are all beneficiaries of the trust. The government is the trustee. In the case of wildlife, this includes state legislatures and state wildlife commissions. As trustees, the government has a duty to manage the trust for all beneficiaries, including those yet to be born, as well as for the benefit of the wild animals themselves. And responsible trust management requires that trustees make an effort to understand, consider, and balance the full range of public views on wildlife, and that demands democratic governance. So there are several reasons why state wildlife management is not democratic, but one important reason is the way it's funded. It's often said that hunters pay for conservation, and sometimes it's even said that hunting is conservation. It is true that hunters and anglers historically contributed significantly to state wildlife agency budgets through their purchase of hunting and fishing licenses and by the taxes they paid when they purchased guns, bullets, fishing gear, motorboat fuel, etc. But it is less true today, but still they account on average for about half of agency revenues. But there are several things to keep in mind about this. One is that the contributions are not voluntary or necessarily altruistic. License fees are what individuals are required to pay in order to be able to convert the public's wildlife into private ownership when, say, a deer is shot or a fish is caught, and taxes are taxes. Secondly, contributing to state wildlife agency budgets is different than paying for wildlife conservation. Much of what state wildlife agencies do is more about selling licenses and keeping hunters and anglers happy than protecting wildlife, as I'll explain in a second. Finally, and I think this is important, even if consumptive users contribute proportionally more money to state wildlife agencies, does that mean they should be given a greater voice in wildlife matters? I don't accept that proposition. When we think about other public goods, such as libraries, schools, fire services, public lands, we don't intentionally try to make access to these goods contingent upon ability to pay. We may do it in fact, but not usually intentionally. And we don't usually give preferential access to those who pay more in taxes. Why? It has to be asked, why should we do so in the case of wildlife? So this is going to get a little bit in the weeds, but it's important to know the current user pay model of funding, it not only promotes a narrative that hunters deserve a greater say in wildlife matters, it also has helped to create these relationships of financial dependency that serve to lock in the privileged position of the users in the current system and fuel resistance to efforts to change the status quo. So let's dig a little deeper into how this works. As I mentioned, federal grants allocated under 2 federal laws are a major source of revenue for state wildlife agencies, Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson. I'm going to focus on Pittman-Robertson because it generates more money, but they both function in the same way. Pittman-Robertson was passed by Congress in 1937. It redirected an existing tax on firearms to the states to support wildlife, quote unquote, restoration and hunter education. At the time, hunters were the largest group of gun buyers, so it made a certain amount of sense to use the tax this way. It was a good deal for the gun industry too, because it took an existing tax that disappeared into the federal treasury and converted it into an investment in a way that benefited a subgroup of gun buyers, namely hunters, helping to ensure demand for the industry's products. Pittman-Robertson funding became and still is a major source of funding for state wildlife agencies, and it's serious money. In fiscal year 2022, a record $1.1 billion in Pittman-Robertson funds were distributed to the states. So Pittman-Robertson enshrined hunters as the privileged users who funded state wildlife agencies and came to be seen as their most important customers. The agencies in turn rewarded hunters by spending most of their Pittman-Robertson funds on projects that benefited hunters and promoted populations of game species. And in addition, Pittman-Robertson created incentives for the states to sell more hunting licenses in two ways. First, Pittman-Robertson required, as a condition of funding, for states to pass laws that prohibited the diversion of hunting and fishing license revenues away from the state wildlife agency. So after it was passed, and those laws and those states passed those prohibitions, the more licenses the agencies could sell, the more money they raised for themselves. And secondly, Pittman-Robertson funds are allocated to the states based on a formula, which is based in part on the number of hunting licenses sold. So that gave the agencies an incentive to sell more licenses to obtain more federal funding. And this was a self-reinforcing relationship arrangement. It worked pretty well for hunters and state wildlife agencies until the wheels started to come off as the number of hunters began a steady decline, as you can see from this slide. In the 60 years since 1960, that's just been a steady decline in the number of hunters. At the same time, gun sales have exploded, particularly in the last 2 decades. And as most of you probably know, there are now more guns in the United States than people. And Pittman-Robertson revenues as a result are at an all-time high. And 2 entities in particular have benefited from this trend. One is, of course, the gun industry and gun advocacy groups. And the second are state wildlife agencies, which these explosive growth in Pittman-Robertson revenues have helped to compensate for the decline in the number of hunters and the loss of hunting license revenues. It's important to note, though, that most guns purchased today, about 3/4 of all guns and bullets sold, are not bought for hunting, but for other purposes, protection, target shooting, what have you. So this is kind of the decline in hunters and the simultaneous rise in gun sales has prompted several changes to the system of wildlife management in recent years. It has redefined the user in the user pay model. And accordingly, Congress recently amended Pittman-Robertson to include recreational shooters as users of wildlife. More public and private money is now being invested in so-called R3 programs, which are aimed at recruiting both more hunters and more non-hunting gun users, particularly youth, women, and people of color. So more hunters, but also more people buying these programs that are aimed at getting more people to buy guns and use them for target practice. So, and it's also the changes in the system have given the gun industry, the gun lobby, essentially unprecedented influence in wildlife matters. And this has led to a coalescing around shared interest of the firearms industry, Second Amendment advocacy groups like the NRA, conservative political groups, hunting groups like the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, and state wildlife managers. Because these entities all benefit from maximizing opportunities for hunting and firearm use, they increasingly coordinate in campaigns to confuse the public, promote hunting over all other interests and values, and protect gun rights. And this is manifested in all sorts of ways. One is the conflation you often see these days of hunting and gun rights, as seen by this example from the NRA's website. I don't know if you can read that first bullet point, but it says, the fight against gun control in general is inseparable from the fight for the rights of hunters. And you see that sort of rhetoric more frequently from both the gun groups and the hunting groups. Another manifestation is the explicit celebration of this partnership between the gun industry and wildlife managers, as seen from this screenshot from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website, describing its partner with the payer program, the goal of which is to connect and build relationships between state wildlife agency staff and gun industry representatives. So pretty explicit in their acknowledgement and celebration of that relationship. For their part, gun groups are happy to take credit for wildlife conservation, as seen in this screenshot from the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the firearm industry trade association, bragging about how the makers of guns and bullets are helping to save wildlife. And this is probably a good time to point out that Pittman-Robertson, as far as I know, is the only federal tax on firearms and ammunition. 100% of those funds go to state wildlife agencies for programs that mostly benefit hunters and gun owners. And this is at a time when the US is experiencing unprecedented levels of gun violence. None of those funds are being used to reduce or mitigate the harm done by guns in our society. Just something to think about. So I'm going to turn it back to Michelle now to talk about the unjust nature of wildlife management.
Thanks, Kevin. So in addition to the undemocratic nature of wildlife decision-making, management is unjust in its treatment of non-game species as well as individual animals. All wild animals care about their health and well-being as well as that of their families. They have intrinsic value and a right to exist beyond their use to anyone else. They also contribute to healthy ecosystems. Everyone plays a part in the web of life. Because wildlife management privileges consumptive users, those that take life, over other interests in wildlife, state agencies manage for what the scholar Freya Matthews calls ecologies of the minimal. Perhaps you've heard of the insect apocalypse or the so-called bird apocalypse. That is ecologies of the minimal at play. State and federal agencies focus on maximizing the number of animals humans want to kill and wait until an imperiled species is in such dire circumstances that they warrant being listed on state and federal endangered species lists. All the while, numbers of once abundant species are in steep decline with little attention or conservation directed their way. According to the 2022 Global Living Planet Index, between 1970 and 2018, on average, there was a 69% decline in population size across the nearly 32,000 studied populations. That's just an average based on monitored populations of known bird, mammal, fish, and amphibian and reptile species. So they're not considering insects, fungi, coral, or plants. And so the loss is likely higher. And a warning about the next slide, this does have a photo of dead coyotes that is graphic. So the typical tools used in wildlife management range from traps, snares, and poisons to calling animals in by playing the sounds of distressed young and then shooting the worried parents. This is why we say wildlife management lacks compassion. Indiscriminate devices like traps are scattered across the landscape and usually not monitored. In many states, traps aren't required to be checked for multiple days. In Nevada, the rule is every 4 days. And we have loads of evidence that many traps never get checked or are lost and left to catch anyone who steps on them. That anyone could be your dog or an endangered species. If you're not prepared with the knowledge and tools to rescue your dog, tragedy can and often has resulted. Body-crushing traps are hidden underwater to drown muskrats and beavers. When those traps are around a dog's head, there is little even a trained professional can do to save them. Sentient beings like coyotes, bobcats, and foxes have little to no protections from this type of killing year-round across the country. Whereas deer and elk, for instance, are only hunted during a certain time of year, non-game species like foxes can be killed during the spring when young will be orphaned and succumb to predators and starvation. Additionally, a hunter is not allowed to kill unlimited numbers of game animals. That would be considered poaching and prosecuted seriously by authorities. On the other hand, participants in wildlife killing contests can compete for cash and prizes to kill the most largest or smallest bobcats, coyotes, even crows and rabbits, all the unprotected living beings unlucky enough to share habitat and space with wanton killers like these contest participants. We've monitored the quote celebrations that occur after weekend killing contests, where the bodies of animals are thrown around to be weighed, disrespected, used as props for photos with children holding automatic rifles, and then discarded. And very quickly, here I want to note that there's an important distinction here. A subsistence hunter is very different from a killing contest participant or other kinds of trophy hunters. And we're not homogenizing all hunters as equally motivated. Just wanted to note that, especially if we have any hunters in the audience. So now back to Kevin for how wildlife management fails to protect biodiversity.
Thanks, Michelle. Another problem with the system of wildlife management today is that it prioritizes the wrong things. As Michelle mentioned, the world's facing a mass extinction crisis. Plants and animals are disappearing at a rate estimated to be 1,000 to 10,000 times faster than the natural baseline extinction rates due to human activities. Wildlife populations are declining precipitously in a process scientists call biological annihilation. And in the face of all this, the US does not have a national strategy for protecting biodiversity. It is up to each state to lead the response to this extinction crisis, and the states are failing to meet this challenge. What state wildlife agencies do and what is needed to protect species and ecosystems are two different things. State wildlife agencies do many things, some of which are listed here. And you can see that many of these things are clearly aimed at managing hunting and fishing and not necessarily protecting wildlife. In my opinion, the items in green possibly qualify as authentic conservation, while the red items fall more under the definition of game management as originally defined by Aldo Leopold. There are many examples of this discrepancy between what agencies do and authentic conservation. I'll just highlight a few. One is that the states are in the business, state wildlife agencies, of protecting or producing non-native species for the benefit of hunters and anglers, sometimes in prodigious quantities, even when those species cause harm to native species and ecosystems, or don't survive for very long in the wild. And here are just a few examples, starting upper left, going counterclockwise. We have pheasants being released. They're not native to North America, if you didn't know. They've been introduced into 40 states. They're often shot shortly after being released, and usually they don't survive long in the wild. And then, well, actually, let's go clockwise. That beautiful antelope there is in fact a true antelope. It's an oryx. They were introduced from Africa into New Mexico in 1969, not native to the Americas. They don't have any predators here, no African lions to keep their numbers in check. But they do a lot of damage to native ecosystems, and the National Park Service had to build a fence around the entire White Sands National Park to keep them out because of the damage they were causing. And I'm going to skip over the mountain goats, which are being introduced into some places where they historically have not occurred, and go right to the rainbow trout. And rainbow trout are only native in North America to states with Pacific drainages, just a handful of states, but very popular with anglers, and they are raised and stocked now in almost every state. The problem is they compete with native fish, they eat native aquatic organisms, and they sometimes hybridize with our native trout species. They're on the IUCN's list of the 100 most invasive species. They don't survive long in the wild. So that's just a few examples. Another example is the way states deal with top predators like wolves and mountain lions. There's a great deal of scientific research showing how important these top carnivores are to ecosystems. But as Michelle mentioned, historically, they've been viewed as with hostility as competitors with human hunters. And in cases where federal protections have been lifted and management returned to the states, those states are aggressively trying to, through hunting and trapping policies, trying to reduce the number of wolves, for example, to as low as possible. Okay, Michelle, back to you.
So we've thrown a lot of information at you about how the current system of wildlife management in the US is undemocratic, unjust, lacks compassion, and fails to prioritize saving all wildlife species and ecosystems. To summarize some of the takeaways, wildlife policy and social justice are intrinsically linked through the currently entrenched system that protects power among a privileged, mostly white, and powerful group of special interests, from trophy hunters to the gun lobby, all of whom are united to take the life of vulnerable others. The current system is essentially a colonizer system. It prioritizes limited funding for conservation by promoting hunting rather than actual conservation that protects wildlife and access to nature, which can benefit all people. It disenfranchises anyone who cares about wildlife existing for their own right or as players in a healthy, functioning, and biodiverse ecosystem. Despite these challenges, there are many practices for promoting social justice and wildlife policy and conservation efforts. Kevin's about to talk about some of the concrete actions you can take today, but more generally, some best practices include prioritizing animal and social justice, what we might call multi-species justice, in our reform efforts. We can incorporate values, best available science, and ethics into decision-making and take an intersectional approach against all oppressions, be they racism, classism, xenophobia, gender bias, heterosexism, ableism, or even anthropocentrism, which is the centering of humans above all other life forms. Democratic decision-making could consider the claims of of humans and non-humans alike, instead of the current stakeholder approach that homogenizes claims based on sociodemographic groups of people. Representation within such processes would be inclusive, democratic, and non-anthropocentric, as well as equitably consider each claim in a decision-making process. Policies would then need to go through not only scientific, but ethical examination that would fact check and value check and clarify the values reflected in different positions and their resulting policies. By prioritizing the needs and inclusion of diverse and disenfranchised communities in decision processes and advocating for conservation practices to respect individual well-being, protect biodiversity and ecosystem health, we can create a more just and equitable governance.
Thanks, Michelle. I think I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time, it's a little bit redundant with what's already been said. These are the principles that guide our advocacy, reform advocacy. So we'll go to the next slide. So our overarching campaign goals for the Wildlife for All campaign are to build a national coalition and basically a movement of wildlife governance reform advocates to raise awareness about the problems with state wildlife management among policymakers, wildlife and social justice advocates, and the general public about the problems. And then to catalyze and support state level campaigns where we can add value, and to replace, and ultimately to replace the current wildlife management paradigm, which is based on control and exploitation of wild animals as resources, with one that prioritizes biodiversity protection, coexistence, and respect for individual animals and their social groups. Some of our specific policy reform goals include revising outdated statutory mandates and authorities related to wildlife management to align with public trust principles, modern science, and public values, to establish new sources of funding for wildlife that are not tied to license sales or the sale of guns and ammunition, to abolish wildlife commissions or to reform them to be more diverse and representative of the broader public. Part of this strategy is to persuade governors to appoint, to think outside the box when appointing individuals to these commissions. And finally, to litigate or find other ways to enforce public trust duties of the wildlife policy makers. And I just want to mention a few of our achievements thus far. And this is, I'm talking about the Wildlife for All Coalition, which includes the nonprofit by that name and our coalition partners. We organized the first national conference on reforming state wildlife management back in 2018. We officially launched the campaign in 2021. We've established a national coalition, which is growing and now includes more than 60 organizations in 30 states. We presented at conferences, generated media coverage, and I will add, we have generated controversy as the beneficiaries of the status quo began to take notice of our work. Our partners have succeeded in getting good commission appointments in states like Washington and Colorado. Reform-related bills have been introduced or passed in numerous states, and we are also looking at ways to leverage federal initiatives like the Recovering America's Wildlife Act to drive state-level reforms. So we encourage you to get involved in your local state wildlife decision-making, learn more about wildlife policy, and advocate for multi-species justice in your communities and state. And together, we recommend 3 actions that you can start with. The first is empowering yourself to be an advocate for justice for all. As Dr. Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Embrace the idea that you have just as much right as anyone to voice your opinions based on your values about how wildlife should be protected. You don't need to be a consumptive user or an expert to participate in wildlife decision-making. Become familiar with the nuts and bolts of state wildlife governance. Check out the resources section on our website, the overview of state wildlife management, Mythbusters section, the Find Your State feature. Share what you learn with your family and friends and neighbors and your community through letters to the editor and opinion pieces. And finally, join with others to increase the power of your advocacy. Stay informed about reform efforts by checking the news section of our website, signing up for our newsletter. If you represent an organization, wildlife or otherwise, consider joining our coalition. And you please contact us directly to learn more about reform efforts in your state, including guidance, our suggestions for how you might start your own reform coalition if you so desire. And with that, thank you very much for listening. We will take your questions.
Okay. There
Stop.
were a lot of questions, and I've tried to group them. There were a number of questions about what could be done, and those were generally asked before the end of the presentation. And I think you've somewhat answered those. Here's one from Christopher. Symptoms of our wildlife governance structure were described as shiny distractions. Do you see the value of fighting these symptoms as a way to engage more of the public, as these issues can be more immediately accessible? If so, how do we balance and interplay fighting the symptoms and the cause? What could that interplay look like?
That's a great question. I'll add a few thoughts, and then maybe Kevin wants to say something as well. Yeah, we can't ignore the immediate needs for sure. And there, I think, are a lot of advantages to getting folks to coalesce around a particular place that they really care about, a particular species that they really care about, and that helps build movement. So definitely do not want to ignore those very important and very immediate needs. I think there's a danger, though, of getting in too much of a triage mentality and not taking a step back and looking at the fundamental system that needs to change. So, my answer is almost always both. You've got to do top down and you've got to do bottom up kinds of approaches to attack these issues. And the longer we ignore the entrenched systems, the longer they're able to continue creating the symptoms that we're fighting. So I think it's got to be a balance of both. And I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, because it's hard and there are limited resources, right? And we've got to make choices and priorities. But I think governance reform has to be made more of a priority. We talk to a lot of organizations who see the issue and they want to get involved. And understandably, their focus is on a particular species or state. And I think we need to empower each other and work together to cooperate more on this fundamental change.
Yeah, I would just add two things. I completely agree with Michelle. We need to do both. And we can do both at the same time. We can use issues that are so egregious, like and so abhorrent to the public, like wildlife killing contests, to oppose those contests while linking their existence to the nature of the system and how we need to both end these contests and reform the system. And I think wildlife killing contest in particular offers presents an opportunity for leveraging the issue to drive system reform. And I would also, the second point is that there are a lot of wildlife groups out there that are dealing with the issues, with wolves, with trapping, with wildlife killing contests, but there are very few organizations out there that are focused primarily on reforming the system itself. So we need to do both. And that's the bottom line. There was more to that question that I don't think we can answer.
Yeah.
For the time
With regard to wildlife killing contests, a listener from Montana, I believe, or Wyoming, is frustrated because they've tried and they haven't been successful. Do you have any suggestions? And along with that, we had a question where the questioner thinks that the way to go is coalition. So maybe those two can go together.
Yeah, I'll go first in answering that one, or trying to answer that one. So there is a coalition. There's a national coalition to ban wildlife killing contests, co-founded by the Humane Society of the US and Project Coyote. So there's a coalition available to support people's state-based work. So check that out. I shared that in answer to someone's Q&A. I don't know if everyone can see that, but it's bankillingcontest.org, has a bunch of information. You can sign up to be a coalition member and learn a lot more about the issue. It's really hard to kind of give broad advice. Some of this work to ban killing contests or traps takes a long time. It takes multiple efforts in either a legislature or through state wildlife agencies. And some of that will depend on the particular state regulations and rules and who has authority over various species that are game or non-game species. So it can get complicated, but you might think that this is such an egregious practice that it's the lowest hanging fruit, but it's still a very tough battle to tackle the understanding around wildlife killing contests because of language. So we've noted that sometimes hunters offer this notion that hunting is conservation. In the case of wildlife killing contests, it couldn't be further from the truth, and it's not science-based and it's not ethical, but yet the language that people use around hunting confuses the broader public about what we're really talking about. And the same thing goes for trapping. There was a ballot initiative to ban trapping in Montana. And I lived in Montana at the time. There might have been a couple actually, but people were very confused. They thought, oh, we're taking a tool away, a wildlife management tool. And that goes to the dominant language around hunting is wildlife management, when that's not true. So tackling language and clarity and public understanding of what wildlife management should be and what wildlife conservation actually is and where those needs are and what the best available science says, that's, I think, a long-term goal that needs to happen before you engage in a big push to ban killing contests in any state.
Yeah, I'll just add that there is this this dynamic of the system that any sort of proposals to reform the system, including just to deal with specific issues like ending wildlife killing contests, they're often always actually met with charges of being anti-hunting, and there is this tendency of the hunting community, if you will, or hunting lobby, the beneficiaries of the status quo, which privileges hunting, to respond that way, to label any sort of even the most reasonable critiques of the system as anti-hunting. And I think it reflects this idea that it's a slippery slope, camel's nose under the tent. If they end killing contests, they're going to take away all hunting, which is nonsense. And I also think that killing contests really starkly expose the morality of the moral complexities, I guess, of killing animals. And there's no pretense of using the animals that are killed. They're just killed because humans can. And it's often dressed up as, oh, it's good management. We need to manage carnivores because otherwise they will overtake the world. And we have on our Mythbusters section, we address that, wildlife needs to be managed. So I'll stop there. We'll go to the next question.
Okay. We have a couple kind of big picture questions and we're running out of time. There's so many good questions. How do you turn around the financing of state wildlife agencies? And then the second one is, have you approached or talked about education, either public schools or colleges, as a way of getting these ideas more embedded in the future leaders?
Okay, education. That's important to do, and one thing we're dealing with is one way the system is perpetuated is that hunting groups have actually done a pretty good job of insinuating themselves and not just hunting groups, but the wildlife management establishment, which predominantly views animals as resources. That is the viewpoint that dominates college level wildlife management programs. And there are even some hunting groups have endowed chairs, like the Boone and Crockett Club has an endowed chair, I think at University of Montana in the wildlife department. And so you really got this interconnection of the establishment with the hunting groups that it serves and that benefit the establishment. So it's tough. I mean, but we are, I think, just from our experience going to conferences like the Wildlife Society, there is I think an appetite on the part of young people in these programs to kind of question the orthodoxy of the status quo and listen to a message of reform. I forget what the first question was. Michelle, do you have anything to add?
About financing the wildlife management alternatives.
Well, one option is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which is a little bill that would be on the scale of Pittman and Robertson, but it'd be federal funding that was supposed to be used by states for non-game species conservation. There's a lot of problems with the legislation as written, that there's little accountability, but if it passed, and it almost passed in the last Congress, that would be a huge source of funding for the states. The states would have to come up with a 25% match like they do for Pittman and Robertson. And that would be an interesting leverage point too, because then you'll have this conversation starting in all the states about, okay, where's the money going to come from for non-game, and then that can open up a lot of opportunities. Michelle?
Yeah, I'll just say that we've got to be very vigilant, as I think it's likely that RAWA is going to pass. So we'll have to be very vigilant in every state and making sure that there's accountability in terms of those funds going towards non-game species and actual conservation. I think that's super important. There's been other options to kind of expand the tax model to non-consumptive users. Sometimes it's referred to as a backpack tax. Taxes aren't very popular, so those have been fought sometimes by the hunting lobby that gains, has something to lose from that sort of thing. So I think that there are other funding models out there that could pool resources from conservation-minded folks. A voluntary donation at the cash register of REI or Patagonia would be one thing that could be, round up to the nearest dollar, could be huge amounts of money. And we've seen that for animal shelter charities to get a huge pot of money from PetSmart just by rounding up those dollars. So doing something like that for conservation could be huge.
So
Okay, I think
it
we have to
looks
wrap
like,
up.
yeah.
We're out of time. So
I know, just briefly, people are wanting to know if you will distribute not only the recording, but the slides.
yes, a link to the recording will be posted on our website and will be sent to all of you, and the presentation itself will also be posted on our website.
Okay.
On the Wildlife for All website.
And people who have those kind of process questions should contact you, Kevin, about somebody wanted to know how to get the two of you to present to their group. Somebody wanted to know about a certificate of participation, that kind of thing. And obviously there were a lot of good questions we could not get to because of time. We're up to 99 questions.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks for everyone who attended. And although we didn't get to all the questions or most of them, we will take a look at them, and maybe we'll add some content to the website to address them.
There were a lot of legal type questions, and since that isn't your area of expertise, and I'm a lawyer, but I'm not going to be answering the questions on the webinar today, but that might be a thought, is to look at just those types of questions.
We'll do the best we can.
Attorneys on there.
Thank you again, everybody, for joining us today. I hope it was worth your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we got a lot of very complimentary comments and questions.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.